What if a man from the upper Paleolithic survived until the present day?
What do you mean, survived? Never died?
Yes. What would he be like?
Well, we think men of the upper Paleolithic were as intelligent as we are. They just didn't know as much. John's man would have learned as the race learned. In fact, if he had an inquiring mind, his knowledge might be astonishing.
What would keep him alive?
In science fiction terms, I would say perfect regeneration of the body's cells, especially in the vital organs. Actually, the human body appears designed to live about 190 years. Most of us just die of slow poisoning.
Maybe he did something right, something everybody else in history done wrong.
Yeah, the pancreas turns over cells every 24 hours, the stomach lining in 3 days, the entire body in 7 years, but the process falters. Waste accumulates, eventually proves fatal to function. Now, if a quirk in his immune system led to perfect detox, perfect renewal, then yeah, he could duck decay.
That's a secret we'd all love to have.
Would you really want to do that? Live 14,000 years?
Anything is possible, right? After all, one century's magic, another century's science. They thought Columbus was a nut job, right? Pasteur, Copernicus?
Aristarchus long before that.
Right.
I had a chance to sail with Columbus, only I'm not the adventurous type.
What?
I was pretty sure the Earth was round, but at that point I still thought he might fall off an edge someplace.
Look around, John. We just did.
I suppose there's a joke in there somewhere, but I don't get it.
It's nothing to get.
Well, what are we talking about?
We were just talking about a caveman who survives until the present time.
As you said, what a chance to learn once I learned to learn. Pretend it's science fiction. Figure it out.
Okay, a very old Cro-Magnon living until the present.
Hello, and welcome. That was a clip from the 2007 film, The Man from Earth, which will be the topic of our discussion today. So welcome, and welcome to the panelists. Thank you everyone for coming. So in 2007, a science fiction drama film called The Man from Earth was released. It was written by Jerome Bixby, who was a short story and scriptwriter for shows like Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, and he wrote many westerns. He also came up with this story idea about what if there was a man who lived to 14,000 years old. And he was born in the Paleolithic period and grew to adulthood and then found he didn't age anymore. And so through his lengthy life, he saw the hunter-gatherers and then the rise and fall of civilizations and then our present-day digital age. And through it all, he manages to keep his little secret that he doesn't age by moving on every 10 years before people start to notice. And that's where this film opens. John, our 14,000-year-old man, is deciding to move on again. He was a professor at a college, and he's back at his house packing up when his college professor friends show up to sort of throw him an impromptu goodbye party. And it's here where John, for the first time, reveals his little secret. And what unfolds is a wonderful intellectual delight as John's professor friends try to challenge John's story, because they each have a speciality in their own field, but they have difficulty doing so. It's a remarkable film. It's won numerous awards, including in our own neck of the woods, the best screenplay at the 2007 Rhode Island International Film Festival. And it's become a bit of a cult classic. So we're going to show several clips today, including a precursor to this movie and also a clip about how the movie got made. So I'm super excited. I'm glad you guys are here. I'm curious, what was everyone's initial reaction about seeing the film for the first time? Your thoughts? Let's start with you, Mike. What did you think?
Sure. Well, it was an interesting film. I was really surprised when it hit the spot where he revealed he was Jesus Christ, which was, it just stunned me because I had never seen the movie before. The other thing, one thing I wondered or thought about would I want to live 14,000 years? I think the question is, would you want to see other people live 14,000 years? Some of the historical
interesting.
figures in this world, would you want to see Adolf Hitler live 14,000 years? I don't think so. So that would be the question I would just look at. Myself, living 14,000 years, living for a long, long time, I think as a good person, I think it would be a good thing for me, a good thing for the world,
Right.
personally. So,
What about you, Brian? What did you initially think?
Very, very, very thought-provoking. It actually really brought out a bunch of ideas and topics that I never really truly did a deep dive into. I mean, I think everyone always has those images of like, hey, what would it be like if I lived forever? But I never thought about like all the ins and outs of it. Like some of the scenes I really enjoyed was when he was talking about like, oh, so you asked me what happened like 3,000 years ago. Do you remember what you did last week?
Right,
Not
that was
really.
very good, yeah.
Yeah, I actually liked it because I would have thought, oh my God, this person must have all this amazing knowledge, but I know we can only store so much stuff up in our head.
right.
And I mean, I forget stuff all the time too. I can't imagine how much stuff, that John's character actually forgot
Right.
over the years. I think as like what Mike was saying too, like when he started talking about like basically being Jesus Christ, that was also very, very thought-provoking too, because the way I like how his story, meeting Buddha, and then, eventually preaching to all these people, and then having those preachings interlaced with mythology and myth and storytelling basically turned into
Something totally different.
exactly, and like his kind of overall reaction to it.
And we're going to get into that a little bit, because
Yes.
I have some thoughts. I'd be real curious when we dig a little deeper into that part of the movie. But those are very good points.
Yes. The last thing is, so I don't obviously monopolize everything.
That's fine.
I love the characters in the movie. I love how they each one of them kind of represented like almost like a different personality type. There's the funny guy. There was a guy who's very serious getting into it. There was the skeptic. Then there was the one gentleman who kind of came in, a psychologist who had these underlying things.
Dr. Gruber?
Yes,
Yeah.
underlying things about him that tilted his opinion on what was happening.
Right.
So
yeah.
it was.
There's a lot of revelations came about,
Yes.
and I don't mean that because we're talking about I mean just
yeah.
from the film
Yes,
itself.
yes.
Excellent. What about you, Karen?
Yes, as Michael and Brian were saying, same as far as it being very thought-provoking, and that thought of, because of course when we see movies or shows, it's hard not to put ourselves in that place. Like, well, what would it be like to be 14,000 years old and I've seen all of these things? And one of the most interesting things, somewhat to the point of what Brian was saying, was this idea where as they're peppering him with questions, well, what was it like to, be, in the Roman Empire,
Right.
etc. Is the fact that he said, I have certain things I remember and certain things that I don't. And it also brings up the point of each of us, when we remember something, that we have certain lenses that we're looking at things through. So just as he maybe has certain opinions about what he saw, or interpretations, so do the other professors.
Exactly.
And their archetypes that they're looking at things through. So it's
Right.
just really interesting. I watched the movie last week and I've been thinking about it all week. So
I stumbled across it because I'm a fan of the original Star Trek series, and it's not for reasons that people probably initially think. I'm not like, oh, I'm a Trekkie or Trekker or whatever it is. I'm into sci. It's really not. I always loved the show. I would watch it with my father because of the ideas. They would take. They would make social commentary a lot of times,
Yeah.
and you can do that best in science fiction. I didn't care about, photon torpedo, none of that. It was the appeal, like, wow, this is really interesting. They're digging into something, and as a little kid, you don't know much about it, but you can tell there's something to this. There's depth, there's philosophy, and so that's what I really liked about it. And as I mentioned, Bixby wrote for Star Trek. He wrote some of my favorite episodes, Mirror Mirror. He wrote Day of the Dove. And he also wrote an episode called Requiem for Methuselah. And this is where he took this idea that we're seeing in Man from Earth, and he first put it on the screen. In fact, I saw in an interview with his son, Emerson Bixby, that he said his dad actually came up with this idea, in 1947, so that far back. Wow. So in '69, he wrote this episode for Star Trek called Requiem for Methuselah, where he kind of introduces this concept of somebody who's kind of immortal. And you can kind of see, and we're going to watch the clip here in a second, where the seeds of this movie then kind of grew out of this concept. So let's take a look at this clip and then we'll talk about it. Sure. Okay.
Have you ever seen a victim of Brazilian fever? They die in one day. The effects are like bubonic plague. Constantinople, summer 1334. It marched through the streets, the sewers. It left the city by ox cart, by sea, to kill half of Europe. The rats rustling and squealing in the night as they too died. The rats.
Are you a student of history, sir?
I am.
A most impressive home, Mr. Flint.
Yes, Shakespeare First Folio, a Gutenberg Bible.
This is the most splendid private collection of art I've ever seen, and the most unique. The majority are the works of Leonardo da Vinci.
Your pleasure, gentlemen. Chess, billiards, conversation.
You said something about savagery, Mr. Flint. When was the last time you visited Earth?
You would tell me that it is no longer cruel. But it is, Captain. Look at your starship, bristling with weapons. Its mission to colonize, exploit, destroy, if necessary, to advance Federation causes. Why don't you play the waltz, Mr. Spock? To be human is also to seek pleasure, to laugh, to dance. Reyna is a most accomplished dancer.
Captain, something else which is rather extraordinary. This waltz I just played is by Johannes Brahms.
Later, Spock.
Captain, it is written in manuscript. In original manuscript in Brahms' own hand, which I recognize. It is totally unknown, definitely the work of Brahms, and yet unknown.
I am Brahms.
And Da Vinci.
Yes.
How many other names shall we call you?
Solomon, Alexander, Lazarus, Methuselah, Merlin, Abramson, 100 other names you do not know.
You were born?
In that region of Earth later called Mesopotamia, in the year 3834 BC, as the millennia are reckoned. I was a Corinth, a soldier, a bully, and a fool. I fell in battle, pierced to the heart, and did not die.
Instant tissue regeneration, coupled with some perfect form of biological renewal. You learn that you're immortal.
And to conceal it. To live some portion of a life. To pretend to age and then move on before my nature was suspected.
So you can see where the seeds of a later movie, The Man from Earth, you could see how he kind of played around with it at that time in the 1960s for an episode of Star Trek. I love the writing. It has sort of a renaissance, the writing and the acting, actually, that gentleman is really good, the way he described the bubonic plague. So my understanding is, so he wanted to do more with this idea from some of the interviews I've seen his son talk about, but he never came back to it. So in the 1990s, Mr. Bixby wanted to work on this screenplay, and he became ill. Yeah, he died in 1998. And on his deathbed in the hospital, he finished the script to The Man from Earth with his son, Emerson, who's also a writer, by his side taking notation. So it's quite fascinating. Like, it was his last sort of, and it's just brilliant that, you know, this is his last work, The Man from Earth, and the ideas, he's still sharp. You saw it in there in that 1969 episode of Star Trek. That's great ideas being philosophy. They're, you know, interesting. And again, this guy's, you know, in his 70s, he's ill, and it's still flowing. Any thoughts about that Star Trek clip being the precursor?
Yeah, I mean, I think the writing was excellent. One question I did have, the blonde lady, was she teaching Captain Kirk how to play pool? That was interesting.
Kirk always has to get, like, that's the, you know, there's always that sort of sexism kind of, yeah.
It was interesting.
Where did she come from then?
Well, there's a whole thing going on.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that was a montage, so yeah.
Is she like his, like, I'm not going to go in there.
Yeah.
But you can see the similarities between that, you know, this clip and the movie Man from Earth, very similar as far as the theme.
He's able to go a little bit further. We learned a little bit more, like he moves on every 10 years and this and that. So we can take a look at the second clip from The Man from Earth. So this is John, and he's kind of going into it. He's revealing how, from hunter-gatherers to present day, how he's relaying his story to these professor friends. And it's interesting to see their reactions. Like you were saying, they each have different personalities and backgrounds. And just to see, as actors, playing those parts, the way they play them and their reactions. Some are annoyed, some are fascinated.
Right, and you start to see them open up, some of them as well, the minds opening up.
So let's take a look at that clip, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay.
Is this why all your students say your knowledge of history is so amazing?
No, that's mostly based on study. Remember, it's one man, one place at a time. My solitary viewpoint of a world I knew almost nothing about.
Well, let's talk about what you say you do know about. Historical times.
Don't encourage him.
Edith.
Next few thousand years, it got warmer.
A few thousand years. See, now, I know you're guessing.
You can't get there from here, Hart.
Well then, pray continue.
We hunted reindeer, mammoths.
Bison, horses. The game retreated northward as the climate changed. You got the idea of growing food rather than gathering it, raising animals rather than hunting them. Am I getting warm here? I bet I am. Lakeside living becomes commonplace, fishing, fouling. Come on! John, this is out of any textbook.
Even yours. You got most of it right. Eventually I headed to the east. I'd grown curious about the world. I'd gotten the hang of going it alone, learning how to fit in when I wanted to.
East. Towards the rising sun.
Yes. I thought it might be warmer there. That's when I saw an ocean. Mediterranean, probably. It was around the beginning of the Bronze Age. So I followed the trade routes from the east. Copper, tin, learning languages as I went. Everywhere. Creation, myths, new gods. So many, so different. I finally realized that it was probably all hogwash. So I was Sumerian for 2,000 years. Then finally Babylonian, under Hammurabi, great man. And I sailed as a Phoenician for a time. See, moving on had been easier as a hunter-gatherer. Difficult when villages emerged. Tougher still in city-states where authority was centralized. Strangers were suspect. It seemed as though I was always moving on. I learned some new tricks. Even faked my death a couple of times. I continued east to India. Luckily at the time of the Buddha.
Luckily.
Most extraordinary man I've ever known. He taught me things I'd never thought about before.
You studied with the Buddha?
Until he died. He knew there was something different about me. I never told him.
This is fascinating.
So there we have it. Any initial thoughts as we dig deeper and he's relaying his story?
Well, yeah, what's interesting is if you look at, you talk about the professor who says, oh, it's just textbook, you learned all this stuff in textbook. And if you look at history, Yeah, I mean, anybody could, talk about that. But as Karen said, if you're living from your point of view, it's difficult for someone to for you to answer a question on what was it like back then. Because again, it's very limited, your little world.
Right.
But obviously this particular guy has lived 14,000 years to have those kind of experiences. Again, it's through his own point of view. And then I think a lot of the other things he's talking about could be based on knowledge that you learn in a textbook. So it's a combination of both.
Well, he even says that. He says, I didn't know what it was called until...
Exactly.
Because his knowledge is only going to advance as quick as the human species. It's not like he has he might have a little more wisdom.
I thought it was interesting. It actually kind of parallels with the Star Trek episode where it's like, why, this one guy happened to be, meet the Buddha and meet these other kind of famous people. It's like, well, what are the odds of that? But then again, as Mike was kind of talking, I was thinking about it more. I'm like, well, I guess that actually does make sense. That I guess if you just happen to run into the Buddha, then everything you basically learn from that person and learn from those adventures would kind of make that person more of a magnet. I guess that makes any sense. Like they would be more people would be more attracted to them because they would start talking. They would have all these different viewpoints and these vantage points. So just by the sheer amount of wisdom and knowledge that he has, he can kind of therefore become famous in that aspect.
Right, that's a good point. And the fact that by this point, he's of course realizing that he's probably immortal, right? It's been several thousand years, right? 10,000 years by the time he meets the Buddha. And so part of that is he can sit peacefully without thinking like, well, I have to get some stuff done because I'm probably going to die in 10 years. So he can actually really, truly be in the moment because he is, in a way, stuck in the moment because he's immortal.
I didn't think that. That's kind of interesting.
So it allows for him to, like you said, being a magnet or for someone who is, someone like the Buddha studying just mindfulness, probably before it was called mindfulness, before these things even have labels, they're drawn together in a way.
But what's interesting, so I agree with you, where him being with Buddha, so you reach that nirvana point in your life. However, the way he's living, where he has to move every 10 years, because you're going to notice you're not aging anymore. Yeah. So there's a lot of, as much as you're trying to live in the moment, there's a lot of stuff coming at him on a daily basis, because he's going to think about, it's tough to live in the moment.
That's
when
a
you
good
say,
point.
okay, I need to get out of here within X amount of days or X amount of years because I'm not aging. People are going to start noticing me.
You could argue it actually makes him better at living in the moment because he's learned that it's all going to come at him anyway. You learn a sense of calmness, like you were saying. Like, all right. And, going back to, like, we saw this with the Star Trek clip where this guy was, I think the difference is that guy was saying he was all these kind of things. We're going to learn that John was Jesus, but that wasn't actually his name. It was, there's a whole thing. But he's not pretending to be as many of these people from history as, say, the Star Trek clip.
Right, in Star Trek, that guy was like a name dropper.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a cocktail party? Oh, yes. It was the 18th century. I wasn't busy. I did this. And I'm like, but yeah, whereas John saying, no, I met the Buddha, which became the inspiration for him to be. And all right, you could say, oh, it's a little too neat that he knows to go east to see the Buddha. But they actually talked about this in one episode of Star Trek, back to that, where there's a theory of time is like a current. And so if he's been around this long and he has this sense of presence and knowledge, he probably has a better sense of what direction to go in life. So that, because he's had plenty of time to do it. You give me 14,000 years, maybe I might be able to beat a few traffic lights for once, But he's kind of going where, all right, well, this isn't the right way. I see there's something really interesting in the east. Let me go to the east. And so maybe it kind of happened naturally like that, I'm thinking.
Actually, it probably makes sense because all it really takes is him to meet another traveler who talks about, oh my God, his amazing experience way out east and blah, 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 blah. And, well, I have to leave here in 2 years, so I might as well keep on going that direction.
Right.
I just
Interesting.
Think about it. Like, say this was you. I mean, you get to see all this and all this civilization, all the rise and fall of everything, and it's just...
Yeah, you also get to live by your mistakes and actually you have more time to make up for those mistakes you made over the course of your 14,000 years, as opposed to someone living 80 years and looking back and maybe having regrets. You keep going. I mean, you have a lot of opportunities to make yourself better, make the world a better place. So.
Right. What's interesting too is because he has to move around a lot. You'd think with 14,000 years of knowledge, he would have a lot to share. Yet, until he meets this group, he's not really able to share that with anybody.
Right. And that's, so why now? Why? And he says in the film, the reason why I want to do it now, I've never done this before, because he wanted them to know a little bit what he was really like, a genuine sense of who he was. And some of them took issue with that. Well, you did that, now I think Edith has all kinds of problems, which we'll see. But I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like, why do you think that's a good enough reason? Like, you do this long enough, you really want to tell somebody?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would think so, yeah.
Talk about having this amazing story and not being able to share it.
Yeah.
I mean, I would, honestly, I mean, if the fact he made it 14,000 years is impressive, I think I would have a hard time making it like 40 years without like being like, oh my gosh, I gotta tell you this amazing story. I was born in 76, I was really born in 1926. Okay, that's 50 years, but get the point.
Yeah. There's also, if you did that, I think one of the fears would be they're gonna throw me in a nut house.
Right.
Because what I'm saying, the guy's insane. That's what a lot of people may think,
Right.
So.
They would try to make a science experiment out of him.
Yes,
They
exactly.
want to know why, what makes you, and you become like the freak, and
Right, exactly.
It is interesting though. He decides to do it now, and obviously it's perfect writing because it's in a room full of college professors. You have an archaeologist, you have a biologist, you have I actually have the list here of all these different people. Edith, I think she's an art history professor, and she's a devout Christian. And what else we got here? And Dan is all right, he's the anthropologist. So it goes on. It's a brilliant idea. When Bixby came up with like, this way, you know what? He didn't take the easy way out. Oh, I just sat in a room at a Dunkin' Donuts and told everyone, and nobody really cared. They just drank their cup. No, then he had to do this, and the ideas, and they pour out, because each of them, and it shows something, a credit to Bixby, because he has to write with some sense of authority on these subjects to be able to at least put it on paper and have it seem like, okay, this, you have some confidence in this.
Right, and they seem to care enough about him, the professors, where if they were just like, okay, we're having a little party for you, well, have a great travels, but they kept peppering him with the questions about, well, why do you have to move on? Where are you going? Yeah. And so maybe in that, he saw that they care about him and said, well, this might be the time to go ahead and
kind of do it.
spill
Yeah, it
this.
seemed like a safe place to reveal that, as opposed to, like you said, reveal it in a coffee shop somewhere. Anonymous people.
Picturing that.
Get the straight jacket out.
Put in the back of a police
Do you want a munchkin with that, or a 12-pack?
Supersize it? Yeah. No, that's McDonald's.
Yeah, that's true. And another thing I liked about they asked him if he had ever met someone else who might have been like him.
Yep.
And that kind of came up, that he thought he did.
Right.
And they said, well, how do you know? And it's something along the lines, we had talked about it, but each one of us couldn't tell if the other one was on the level. But then, like 400 years later, or whatever it was, I thought I saw him at a train station in Belgium or something like that. That's got to be kind of wild.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to talk about is the biological aspect of it. And they kind of touch on this in the beginning because you have the biologist in the room, and he talks about, anything is possible. It could just be a mutation. Something he has, the biologist said it better, Bixby writes it better in the show, but some sort of, the pancreas turns over cells very quickly, and there was some sort of mutation perhaps with him that caused this sort of, that's kind of fascinating to me. No?
I think it is, because is that actually even really possible? I mean, I can kind of understand, like, okay, he can heal it really, really fast. But I mean, there's some injuries. I thought there was a clip where he talked about, like, I guess he got stabbed with a spear, or something happened. I might be getting that mixed up with the Star Trek episode. And I was always wondering, like, well, I mean, if you
Right.
fall, what do you crack your head really hard?
Something in his biology allows it. And it's kind of interesting because I read a book, I read a couple of Yuval Noah Harari's book. I think you might be reading one
Yes,
right now,
yes,
Sapiens
Sapiens, yeah.
and Homo Deus. And he actually touches on this, that we may be, in the next 100 years or so, getting to the point where, for all intents and purposes, you could be immortal, the human being, in a sense. And it's more of a combination. It goes into it in the book about part biological, part computer, part different things. Or not just with our advancement in medicine, but just a combination of things that we might, and eugenics, which that's a whole other subject, with people choosing the DNA for their children, which there's a long thing, but we could be getting to something like that possibly one day. And it kind of makes you reflect, like, oh, they, well, maybe we'll talk about that at the end of the show, but would you guys want to find out, let's say at whatever age you are now, we'll talk about it right now, at whatever age you are now, you start aging, and then 10 years go by and you still look the same, 20, 30, whatever age you are now, and then 100 years go by, would you want that?
Yeah, I think it'd be pretty amazing.
Well, I wouldn't be so concerned about the looks as the brain. If the brain would stay the same or continue to grow in a way, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to just be eternally young with a brain that is just,
Right.
not necessarily functioning where I would like for it to be, to learn more.
To keep learning, as long as you could keep learning.
But sure, yeah, if I could keep learning, whatever the outside state looks like, I'm good with it.
I struggled with this one too. I heard this amazing phrase, like death gives us a purpose to live. And I was thinking to myself, okay, so if I was, immortal and I would no longer age, then what would be my purpose? What would be my motivation in life? I mean, I can see, okay, maybe if I truly dedicate myself to constantly helping people wherever I was at and really try to revolve myself around that idea, sure, maybe. But then again, it's still like, it's like going on a road trip. Okay, road trip has an end. I will eventually get to my buddy's house, or I'll eventually get home, or eventually get to
Right.
San Diego or wherever I'm going. It's like being on a road that never ends, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think if you were going to live that long, you would have to consistently have a passions, whether it's playing guitar, whether it's exercising, traveling the world. You'd have to have a purpose as well.
Yeah.
If you don't have a purpose living that long, I think eventually you would just lose interest in living, myself personally. But if you can maintain passions, you can maintain purpose, you can maintain your health brain-wise, physically, if you're not, crippled, who cares about the looks? Yeah, I mean, it could be good. It could be a good thing.
I've thought about it, and I think, touching on your point, I think the Buddhists, speaking of the Buddha, they sort of comes down to three things: have something to love, have something to do, have something to hope for.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find appealing about it is I want to know how this story of human beings, how it pans out, and I think that's the appeal of living a long time. It's like, do we destroy ourselves, or do we learn to work together, and do we learn to solve our problems? You look at the long history and all those wars and battles and changes, but you also look at the hopeful thing in the arts and the culture. I still read the newspaper, the old-fashioned newspaper every day. I just, this is going on, and halfway around the world. I want to know how. I think that's the only thing about death that. Well, there's probably, as Woody Allen said, it's not that I'm afraid of death, I just don't want to be around when it happens. But I think one of the things that is kind of sad for me about death is, I want to know how things turn out. I want to know in 300 years, did human beings manage to fix problems? Did we solve things? What happens? And that's, there's just, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, it's true. And would good overcome evil? I mean, that would be a question I would have, because you see so much evil in the world. Some people predict eventually it'll just be such an evil world, we'll destroy ourselves. So it is interesting to be able to say, okay, how does this end?
Right.
So.
I, I think that's the only thing about death is, I want to know how things turn out. I want to know how things All right, well, let's watch the next clip. So this one is probably the heaviest of the clips. This is where John gets into sort of his background, and we start to see he has a history with some religious history background in his long life, which kind of upsets especially Edith, which we'll see. So we'll have a lot to talk about. Let's take a look.
Did you ever meet any person from our religious history? A biblical figure?
In a way.
Who?
We should skip this one.
No, skip it. Come on.
And the next question.
No, come on.
Come on, John. You
Skip.
let this
Come on,
run.
come on, spit it out.
Good Lord, you were one of them.
This is going in a direction that I didn't expect. I hoped it wouldn't. We call it a night.
Come on. You were someone in religious history?
Yes.
In the Bible?
Yes.
Someone we know?
How could we not know someone in the Bible?
I mean, somebody important.
Well, you may think you know him, but it's mostly myth.
The entire Bible is mostly myth and allegory with maybe some basis in historical events. You were part of that history?
Moses.
Moses was based on Mysis, a Syrian myth. And there are earlier versions, all found floating on water. A staff that changed to a snake. Waters that were parted so followers could be led to freedom and even receive laws on stone or wooden tablets.
One of the apostles.
They weren't really apostles. They didn't do any real teaching. Peter the fisherman learned a little more about fishing.
How do you know that?
The mythical overlay is so enormous and not good. The truth is so simple. The New Testament in 100 words or less. You ready?
All right, John, hit us with the short form.
Guy met the Buddha, liked what he heard, thought about it for a while. Say 500 years while he returned to the Mediterranean. Became an Etruscan, seeped into the Roman Empire. He didn't like what they became. Giant killing machine. He went to the Near East thinking, why not pass the Buddha's teachings on in a modern form? So he tried. One dissident against Rome. Rome won. The rest is history. Well, sort of. A lot of fairy tales mixed in.
I knew it. He's saying he was Christ.
Oh no, that's the medal they pinned on Jesus to fulfill prophecy.
The crucifixion.
He blocked the pain, as he had learned to do in Tibet and India. He also learned to slow his body processes down to the point where they were undetectable. They thought he was dead. So his followers pulled him from the cross, placed him in a cave. His body normalized as he had trained it to. He attempted to go away undetected, but some devotees were standing watch. He tried to explain. They were ecstatic. Thus I was resurrected, and I ascended to Central Europe to get away as far as possible.
Taken alone, the philosophical teachings of Jesus are Buddhism with a Hebrew accent. Kindness, tolerance, brotherhood, love, a ruthless realism acknowledging that life is as it is, here on earth, here and now. The kingdom of God, meaning goodness, is right here, where it should be. I am what I am becoming. That's where the Buddha brought it.
And that's what I taught. But a talking snake made a lady eat an apple, so we're screwed. Heaven and hell were peddled so priests could rule through seduction and terror, save our souls that we never lost in the first place. I threw a clean pass. They ran it out of the ballpark.
It's been said that Buddha and Jesus would laugh or cry if they'd known what was done in their name.
And if there is a creator, probably feel the same way.
Heavy stuff there.
It's brilliant, though. It gives you a lot to... So let's unpack a little bit of this. I think what I found very interesting about this, take aside the fiction of the story of a man who lives for 14,000 years. Take that out of the picture, and I think what he's relaying could be very well how it happened. The story of Jesus, and we have to be careful. I know a lot of people, Edith is particularly sensitive to this, but it could just be that simple. And when you have agenda and societies and power structure, you can see how something could get turned into something else. Because just like he said, Jesus would probably be, and the Buddha would be pretty upset about some of the things being done in their name today. But it just could be that simple. It could have been a person or persons with these peaceful ideas, and it was sort of, I don't know. What do you think?
And I think if you look at religion, there's been so many religions over the history. The Roman Empire basically ended up adopting Christianity at Constantinople, and it was basically because they can control people. It was a religion that was chosen based on, they could still have their pagan gods, and they weren't, the Christians were persecuted for a very short period of time before the Roman Empire said, yeah, we're going to go with Christianity as our religion.
Right.
So again, it becomes a control part of society.
Yeah.
The power structure says, okay, we're going to choose this as the religion, add all kinds of things to it to control people. So yeah, based on a simple idea, a good teaching from the beginning, it became, just like most religions, about controlling people. So yeah, it makes sense. It really does. So.
Right.
I think I read a book. It was called, I was trying to remember the name of it. I think it's called Holy Grail, Bloody Grail, and it was basically about how, what was it? One of them, I think, was trying to say, oh, Jesus Christ actually did not die on the cross. He actually lived and actually had offspring and da-da-da-da. And, you know, he was actually royalty. His father was, you know, the king of Jerusalem, and also about all this other stuff. And I think also talking about, like, I think it was in, like you said before, like in 380 or 330 AD, that's when, you know, the Roman Empire, like, adopted Christianity. And I think I remember reading somewhere, too, that they basically had, I guess it was like 12 different books, including one by Mary Magdalene, sorry. Been a while since I've been to church. And they basically said, okay, we're going to pick these 4 ones and kind of morph them to what we want.
Yeah.
And I think I was also reading, too, I guess a lot of these books weren't written for like a couple hundred years after Jesus' death.
Yep.
So, like I said before, I have a hard time remembering what I did like 2 weeks ago. I can't imagine what it's like, well, I told my son, who told his son, who told his daughter, who did, you know, 5 generations down the road, like, this is what this person said, sure.
Right.
Yeah, and there were certain gospels that the leaders of the church just basically wiped out of the historic teachings of the church because it didn't fit into their structure, how the things wanted to be taught. So,
Yeah, it's fascinating. Just religion in general, like even outside of watching it in this movie, but seeing the way that it's talked about in this movie, it just adds a whole other layer with that idea of him being Jesus and having studied with the Buddha, and then you know, several 1,000 years later, I think.
I have I'll find the answer to
Yes.
that. Yes, I always have something. But yeah.
But regardless of the time, this idea that, you know, just over the centuries, how religions formed within relatively the same time frame, all different religions happening all over the world before technology, before this stuff is being shared, like, oh, here, this is what we taught, here's your thing, and now you can teach how you want to.
Right.
That part of it, like the idea of when humans became more conscious of these things and had a need to name them. So these things are happening all around us all of the time. The beauty of you know, nature, the sun, whatever it is, how we perceive things. So how I perceive the sun. I like rainy days, right? So someone might be like, that's a great sunny day, and I'm like, I kind of miss the rain. It's been sunny for 10 days, right? So what is considered good, right? What is considered beautiful? Just how the filter that each of us has for perceiving something as simple as a sunny day. And then you bring that to all of these just enormous questions and the idea of how humans view the world and how they view themselves once they pass. You know, some people don't think anything happens. That's it. You're done. and then others believe reincarnation, others believe heaven. It's endlessly fascinating.
It is. To answer your question, so the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was born 563 before the Common Era, approximately, and Jesus was approximately 4 BCE, before the Common Era, or 4 AD, it's somewhere in that period. And it's interesting what they said about, John talks about where did the name Jesus came from. And it's a nice little piece of interesting, outside of this movie, of like, well, the name evolved from, they used to say it this way, but then you went to this other society and they borrowed the name from this and that, and then it just came out, So Jesus wasn't even his name, it's just like, it was something, that's what it's turned to,
I like that scene too.
Right.
In fact, I wish I could remember like what was the steps again? It was like John to Johann
to
and then Jesus.
Right. Well, it's the same thing like December 25th. I mean, if there was a person, Jesus, that really was decided later, well, let's make that the birth of Christ Day. Well, they didn't know. I mean, that was determined later. I've read things like it was in the summer, and something like that.
Was it supposed to line up with, I think it was like a pagan holiday around that time.
Right.
So that's just to kind of incorporate the two.
The Christmas trees, the whole idea of the tree and everything. And it just really brings the point forward that just humans need a way to explain things. I think Buddhism is one of those traditions where it's not as necessary to explain. It's that idea of
present moment.
Your present moment. Not, as Laurie Anderson, one of my favorite musicians and Buddhists, I remember her saying after her husband Lou Reed passed away, she was studying with one of her Buddhist teachers, and he said it's really important to feel sad but not be sad, right? So that's just one really simple statement, but it's that idea where, and that was so comforting for her. She's like, okay, that makes sense. For all of these traditions, like I was raised Catholic, and there are many things that I loved about that. This picture of me 4 years old with the little manger that my dad took with my head on the manger. Those traditions. So we love tradition. We love belonging.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So a lot of whatever the religious tradition, giving us that sense of belonging.
Sense of community.
Exactly. And in this movie, you can see that sense of community just within this little human, the professors, this human gang of professors, and finding their way in that, and some just being very upset, like Edith, and then others seeing that spark of, okay, this makes sense with how I see the world, and I'm making it make sense, and I'm not making it make sense. So it brings up all of those things, just about being human and existence. It's
right.
It's really fascinating.
In a way, I can understand Edith. Her whole life is based on this, based on her belief system, and John tells a story at a impromptu party that's sort of shattering everything that she's held dear to her. And it's, you could argue, well, some of the things you were talking about, and that's my own sense of things, like, there's a sense of community and warmth in the church setting. It brings people together. There's kindness, there's love, there's hope, these things that we talked about. And those are attractive qualities. And that's what I always find in my own personal religious belief, whether it's in the Christian church or Unitarian Universalism. It's all, those are the positive aspects. But she seems to think out, she likes a very probably structured way, and she's taken the way it's written very personal, and so it's very difficult for her to hear this. And so when I first watched it, I'm like, oh, Edith, and then I was like, this is too much too fast for her, and I can kind of understand her character. And John's very kind to her. He didn't even want to go down this road.
Right.
They kind of pushed him,
Yeah, I think religion in general, I mean, you could be
delicate.
You could be very cynical about religions. I was brought up a Catholic. And think about all the bad things that you were taught, things with the priests, what they did, historically. And I remember when I was a kid, I would challenge, as a teen, I would challenge the Catholic Church as far as the faith. I was a cynical kid at the time. And my mother used to say, you just have to have faith. So looking at some of the bad things in any religion, you can approach religion that way. You can say, like you did, talk about community and some of the good things that every religion has, whether it's Catholicism or anything to do with Christianity it's kind of suspect as far as a story, but it can be good for people just because of the community, goodness, kindness. So there's a lot of good things about religion, but I think it gets tied up in the bad things mainly because of control. They want to control people.
And that's what he spoke to. He ran away to Central Europe, I think he said?
Yeah.
Because he couldn't believe what they were doing with us.
Exactly. So
it's pretty heavy. So as the film ends, we didn't see a lot of him in the clips, but Dr. Will Gruber, the older psychiatrist gentleman, kind of challenged John a bit on it. Remember there was the scene where he pulls out the gun?
Yep.
If you haven't, hopefully you've already seen the film, but you'll know what I'm talking about. But each one of them leaves this party with a different sense of things. I think Art doesn't ever want to see John again.
Yep.
He thinks John. I even have a little list here of how their reactions of how Edith is relieved because at the end John sort of goes, "Oh, it was just a joke." So that's the thing. At the very end, John's like, "No, it wasn't real," because he saw where this was going, the religion and the heaviness and people being upset, and so he says, "Oh, let's talk about that before we get to the
story he was writing."
Do you think John, the character, he kind of had to do that at the end? Like, okay, do you blame him?
I think he was being kind. He was being kind. He saw how upset Edith was, and he was just using some of the things he learned over the course of his 14,000 years. Be kind.
For the love of God. For the love of me. Be kind. Yeah. Yeah, I get it. So Edith seems relieved. Harry, the biologist, he kind of indicates he has an open mind on it. Dan, I like Dan a lot. I don't know why. I just like the actor who played him. I really liked him. By the way, the acting was all very, very well done.
Absolutely.
The guy who plays John, that was a lot. We were talking during the clip. That was a lot to memorize as an actor, and then play it with sort of authenticity. Like, he really sold it. Like, I would believe it. Like, yeah, that's the guy. So Dan kind of is implied to believe John. Art never wants to see John again, probably.
Just wants to hang out with a girl, a student. I mean, spend some time teaching a student.
Well, that's interesting because Linda, who was the girl, she kind of is inclined to believe John. And then
good point.
Sandy, who is the sort of love interest, there's a whole side sort of story there. I think she believes John. And then, of course, the secret with Dr. Gruber.
Right.
I guess I'll reveal. There are some spoilers here. So Dr. Gruber overhears John talking to Sandy at the very end and realizes from something he said that John was actually his father.
The different names he went by.
Yeah.
So he'll say, I'd always go by unusual names like Oldman.
Lived in Boston.
I lived in Boston, so was it Boston Tea Party? So it was like Partey. John Partey. And that's when Dr. Gruber's like,
it has a heart attack.
Yeah. Yep.
And he's like, what was my dog's name? And he tells him, and then he dies.
It's kind of a spin on Star Wars. I'll be a father.
Yeah, but the guy's younger than you. Wouldn't that be weird? That might be weird. Mike, I'm your father. I didn't want to tell you, but I just...
No!
Yeah. So if it was one of you guys being told the story and you genuinely trust John, would you be okay with it? Would you be able to handle that well?
I think of somebody like Donald Trump who says he's the chosen one. So no, I would have trouble accepting that.
Yeah.
I'm the same boat too. There would always be that doubt. There'd always be that, just that little sliver of doubt that would always back my mind. That would kind of dissuade me from believing him 100%.
Right.
Agreed. Because even if he believed it himself, as the psychiatrist or psychologist was saying, he just believes it himself. So it doesn't mean it's true.
Yes, yep.
He just has
Yes.
that delusion that
That's
this
true.
all happened.
Yeah, I think
So-
in today's society, you would be considered delusional if you
Right.
attempted that.
So what you're saying is that Dunkin' Donuts don't relay this story. I'm alive for 14,000 years. Where is my coffee?
I've been waiting for a long line, 14,000 years.
Dunkin' Donuts is fine.
No.
Interesting.
But even if you had a best friend and, you know, all of a sudden the guy tells you, hey, this, you'd say, are you out of your mind?
If you could show proof, but you still, I mean, how do you prove it?
I gotta show proof.
Well, even like the girl, Linda, said, well, where were you in such and such a day? He goes, where were you, you know, last week or whatever. It's like, do you remember your parents' house? You know, how you got around town? Like, did you take, well, yeah.
You meant, well, from the Bible, doubting Thomas. He would not believe Jesus Christ was now alive, put to death, now risen from the dead, unless he put his fingers in the wounds of Christ. I'd be a doubting Thomas on that, for anyone who would say that. You know.
Well, I actually am a doubting Thomas. Because my last name's Thomas, so. It doesn't,
It would be tough to believe. It would be tough to believe.
Actually, there's one other scene I was remembering about too, where I think it was towards the beginning where he had some of those artifacts, like I think it was an old tooth or something like that, and they started asking like, well, my gosh, you must have like all this memorabilia must have collected over the years,
interesting.
which I know is actually there's one difference between like that story and the Star Trek episode was, you know, obviously the guy had all this artwork surrounded by all this stuff, and John's like, well, I don't know that this mug is just a mug.
Right.
3,000 years from now, okay, sure, worth millions of dollars, but I don't know that.
He had the painting that he was putting in the back of his pickup.
Oh, the Van Gogh, yes.
He's like, and even if it was, he just kind of shoved it in the back of I was, what are you doing?
An open bed truck, I'm like, is it going to rain?
Good God. Like, even if it was just a gift from a friend 200 years ago, I still would kind of like,
Exactly.
But that was interesting because he said, I think it was the pen. Like, if I had this, what would possess me to keep this pen?
Exactly.
I don't know that there's going to be an eBay or I'm going to be on Antiques Roadshow 500 years from now. I'm like, I have this.
Classic pick.
Yeah, the guy traveled light. He didn't have a lot of...
And you have to if you're moving every 10 years. Yeah. Anyway. So we have one last clip, and it's about how the film got made. It talks about how the writer's son, Emerson Bixby, met the director, was it John Schenkman, I believe it is, and how the movie came to be. It almost didn't come to be. So this is kind of interesting. Let's take a look.
Well, technically, my first memory of Man from Earth is way back in like the early 70s when Dad is like, I still want to do this story. I did it on Star Trek, but I still want to do this story about an immortal caveman. In late 97, Dad's like, screw it, I'm going to write Man from Earth. In, I guess, February of 98, he started typing. He had a heart attack in April of 98, went to the hospital, and finished it literally dictating it to me. I've told this story 100 times, but dictating it to me, I'm writing it down on like hospital napkins and stuff. And here we are.
And then when he died, Emerson typed it up and had the script and went out to try to get it made.
And Richard had read the script before, and he loved it because we'd gotten it to him. He was the first person, and he's like, he's like, wow, this is great, I love it, it's exactly what I want to do, it's character-oriented, it's contained, we can do this.
And then we had another couple of conversations, and I thought, okay, we're making a movie. And then silence.
My agent at the time wanted to go with this big budget, that big budget, big paychecks, and destroy the property.
And then they went down that road, but of course all those people wanted to change the script into making it a big action movie, or just to take what Bixby had written and make that maybe the first act. And then after that, he's on the run from the CIA who want a sample of his blood or whatever, whatever the hell it is.
Oh, I love it, it's great. The problem is these idiots never leave the room. We throw in some flashbacks. He's leading the Wagaboo tribe, or the bunch of, who've got velociraptors, right? He's got these saber-tooths and mammoths.
And Emerson didn't want any part of that.
These ideas are being thrown at me, and I'm like, no. And then large sums of money are being talked about. And my manager at the time, he's like, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. I'm like, no, we're not.
Years go by. Filmmaking equipment gets smaller and cheaper.
Richard and I were talking, we've talked often about producing a film together. I hadn't produced a film yet.
And I was talking to Eric Wilkinson about it, and Eric was saying, yes, let's make a movie, but this is how much we can spend, maybe 110,000. And I said, well, my friend just did that. And Eric said, great, what script have you got that we can shoot that inexpensively? And I said, nothing I've ever written. But there was this one script I read years ago.
He had mentioned that that he had an acquaintance that had a script called The Man from Earth, and it was something that could be shot on a modest budget, which was important to me for being my first one. I wanted it to be successful, and I didn't want to take big risks with other people's money.
Richard comes back out of the blue, years later, and he's like, hey, remember me? I'm like, yeah. He's like, hey, do you still? I'm like, and again, here we are.
Considering the fact that Jerome Bixby wrote the script, he was original writer for Star Trek, it was very, it attracted me to it.
Mirror, Mirror, it was my dad's first Star Trek because he fell in love with the show immediately. Wrote Mirror, Mirror, it was really, really good.
When I found out that after, during my research time, and I was looking into the episodes of Star Trek that Bixby had written, I was surprised and happy that here I was attracted to this material for The Man from Earth, and he had written one of my mom's favorite episodes of Star Trek.
All right. Correction, the director was Richard Schenkman. I said John Schenkman. But,
we'll forgive you.
That was kind of interesting. I love how the Emerson, the son, was saying, like, my dad wrote this great script, which I hear was turned into a play. And you can see that because it has a nice living room setting with all this wonderful dialogue. And, they had these, Hollywood had these other ideas. The Velociraptors, and, we'll do this. And it's just like, I'm so glad he just held his ground and decided not to do that, But it's kind of amazing that it got made. Another thing that I read about is when the film came out, I guess there was some piracy online and it was posted online. And it actually helped the film because it was an independent, it was a small film, but the word got out. And everybody, all science fiction films and so forth, Star Trek fans, they were watching this. Problem is, they weren't making any money, the producers of the film, so I think they put up a web page where you can make a contribution. Or they said, if you really like the film and you saw it online, please go out and purchase it. So
did,
I went out and I purchased it. So
excellent. Good job,
there
Jeff.
you go. It's a good film. Any thoughts about that clip about how it got made?
The fact it was made is kind of amazing because, as he said, they wanted to make this into this massive production, and he stuck to his guns. He was that into the film, what he did. He wanted this story to be told, which is probably very difficult when there's money chasing you in the movie industry. So it actually, I was glad to see it in the format that he wanted it to be in, but with pressure from, big budget, movie makers, I was glad he stuck to his guns.
Yeah.
It was good.
Definitely, and it's really neat too how, because we saw the clip for the Star Trek episode, and then we've seen the clips for the movie, and how in a way the movie brings it more into reality, right? With Star Trek being more the sci-fi, and this being presented in such a way that it's everybody in a living room, and just the way we might have a conversation.
Yeah.
Like we're having a conversation now in your living room. And so it brings it to an interesting level in that way. Because as you mentioned in our conversation earlier, how you love Star Trek for the different ideas that it poses. So in a way, this brings it to a point of the everyday, where it's, you're not necessarily on another planet, and there's some android teaching you how to play pool. I just bring it, it's all about the ideas, and it's really nice that, such a great tribute to his dad as well, like probably the way that his dad would have liked it to be presented, where it's the idea is just right there, pure.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for being on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. This has been a wonderful pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. And thank you for watching. That concludes our episode. Please join us next time when we hope our guest will be singer Rick Astley. Cheers. Doesn't know she's an android. Is kind of making moves. Of course, Kirk is going to try to steal the.
I was always wondering if like the other actors are like, really, again, you know, I mean, poor Spock.
No, you had Bowen saying, she's an android, Jim.